Ladies and gentlemen, may I request you to please take your seats. We are going to start the first session, first technical session. The strategic overview of China's quest for leadership in the global context. We have in the chair Ambassador Nalin Suri, Director General Indian Council of World Affairs, Professor Prasenjit Dwara from Duke University, Ambassador Shashanka Menon, former National Security Advisor, Government of India and Chairman of the Advisory Board of the Institute of Chinese Studies, Ambassador Bilahari Kaushikal, Ambassador at Large, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore. Over to you, Ambassador Suri.
Distinguished panelists. To some extent, to a large extent, the Honorable Governor's address and the keynote address given by Master Shyamkaran have already set the stage for our discussion. But let me take the liberty as chair to make a few general remarks. Some of it is repetition of what you already heard. I think for the sake of completeness and as an introduction to this session, I will still make this remark. We will follow a speaking order, and Mr. Menon will speak first, and Mr. Kaushikal, and then Mr. Dwara will speak after that. We are going to try and stick to 15 minutes each. I think Professor Dwara might require a little more time, that we should have at least about 40 minutes for questions and answers. The outline of China's quest for global leadership has been spelled out by Xi Jinping, as we heard already in his report on the 19th Party Congress. The Chinese nation, according to Xi, now stands tall and firm in the East, and it has blazed a new trail for other developing countries to achieve modernization. China, he said, offers Chinese wisdom and a Chinese approach to solving the problems facing mankind. And yet at the same time, he said that China must do more to safeguard its sovereignty, security and development interests. So there is obviously a problem somewhere. Looking ahead, it's possible to glean from Xi Jinping's report clear strands of the Chinese approach to its quest for global leadership. These include the need for a peaceful international environment. We all know why. China is most dependent on the world than most countries. For China to pursue a mutually beneficial strategy of opening up with a 2-hour lead, to build China into a strong maritime country, and approach the BRI as a new platform for international cooperation to create new drivers of shared development. The Chinese narrative is quite clear, and to achieve these objectives, China, according to Xi Jinping, will take a new approach to develop state-to-state relations with communication, not confrontation, and partnership, not alliance, as the basis. The signaling is quite clear. Terrorism will be opposed forms. The intention is to foster a new type of international relations. Everything now is going to be new. The new era, a new type of international relations, featuring mutual respect, fairness, justice, and win-win cooperation, and build a community shared future for mankind. China, Xi Jinping said, will pursue an independent foreign policy, never give up its legitimate rights and interests, while working to build a framework for major country relations, featuring overall stability and balanced development. The question of what are major countries remains to be defined. China will guarantee its political security, resolutely combat infiltration, subversion and sabotage, as well as violent and terrorist activities, ethnic separatist activities, and religious extremist activities. So the threats are clearly spelled out. China intends to promote trade and investment liberalization and facilitation, and make economic globalization more open, inclusive, and balanced. This, as I mentioned earlier, is an existential issue to China. China will, she stressed, continue to play its part as a major and responsible country. As I said earlier, neither major nor responsible have been spelled out, and take an active part in reforming and developing the global governance system, and keep contributing Chinese wisdom and strength to global governance. It will also get actively involved in global environmental governance, As the largest pollutant in the world, with an extensive program in place for mitigation, China will want to ensure that it has an important role to play in international decision-making on this critical issue. China's projected foreign policy approach is to be supplemented by building a powerful and modernized army, navy, air force, rocket force, and strategic support force to confront the profound changes facing China's national security environment. The use of ambiguous phrases notwithstanding, the stage appears set for a confident and aggressive China to use the contemporary state of confusion, complexity, and divided leadership in the international community to try and fill the void. There will be a pushback, though that seems to have already started, and that will determine the extent to which China will succeed in its quest for leadership, first in Asia, and thereafter in those parts of the world on which it is dependent for resources, technologies, and markets. With those opening remarks, it now gives me great pleasure to give the floor to Ambassador Menon. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking me to speak at the first India Forum China and being such a distinguished company. I was asked to speak on the strategic underpinnings of China's foreign policy. Of course, that depends, what that means depends on your theory of the case. What you think matters in foreign policy determines foreign policy with personalities, structures, institutions. I don't want to give you a lecture in IR theory. But to my mind, China, like all other powers, reacts to external stimuli as seen through the lens of her own idea of her national interests, while seeking goals that she sets for herself, so that as China gains agency in the international system, gains power, her agency and her role in actually trying to shape the environment around her increases. And that's the phenomenon that we're watching. So rather than looking at what they say in the 19th Party Congress, because frankly, if you look at the record of party congresses over history, not one of them has ever been implemented. It's a terrible record. It's a good indicator of what people might want to do. More important, it's a better indicator of what they want you to believe, but it's no indicator of what happens in the future. And I think we should remember that before we get caught in the words and in the phrases and in overanalyzing them and getting stuck in there. So what I'd like to do actually is to look at the more fundamental drivers of China's foreign policy, which have been true before the Congress and will be true for a much longer time. Because what we see throughout the past at least is that while China's foreign policy practice changes depending on the situation, on her capabilities and so on, the basic goals of overturning all vestiges of that century of humiliation, which includes Taiwan reunification, etc., in it, and a return to what is perceived in China as the historical norm of China's global primacy, which I think is factually wrong, but that's the belief, and that's what I think is it. Those remain the same and have been constant right through, irrespective of the actual practice or the adjustment to the objective situation that they perceive around them and the capabilities that China has. Because when we say that for the first time now Xi Jinping says that China should take center stage, adopt much larger responsibilities, I think that reflects a change in practice, not so much in the goals. Whether that practice can achieve these goals and help them to depends on the situation around them and the longer term drivers that I think we need to look at, namely the demographics, the economics, the technology, the geography in which they are, and the internal politics, all of which contribute to the diplomacy and the politics around them. How does China perceive the situation around her right now? Xi Jinping said in the Party Congress, here I'm breaking my own rule, currently conditions, both domestic and external, are undergoing complicated changes. Our country is in an important period of strategic opportunity in its development. The outlook is extremely bright. The challenges are also extremely grim. you notice that opportunity is strategic here. Challenges are grim, but they're not strategic. That's not, so there's a difference here. I mean, there is net. It's obviously the opportunity that prevails, at least in the Chinese perception of what they, and there is no question, I think, for an outside observer, that the present situation does present China with an opportunity. She faces no existential threat. The nuclear deterrent has been effective. Separatism in Tibet and Xinjiang can really be managed. It's a manageable problem. Balance of power in her vicinity has not been as favorable to her for over 2 centuries. So what Marxists used to call the international correlation of forces works for her today. Her role in the international system has grown considerably, her agency, her importance to the world economy as a source of growth, the vacation of space by a transactional Trump administration, her rapid accumulation of hard power over the last 30 years, and her increasing ability to project power. All this make for relative freedom of maneuver and strength for China. And we've seen the results in a much more assertive, muscular, Nalin says, policy in the South China Sea, East China Sea, in territorial maritime disputes, and order-building steps by China, such as not just consultative ones with others like the NDB, but also the AIB, the BRI now, even more so. And to that opportunity, I think we should add motive. Because from China's point of view, several elements of the actual situation around her remain unsatisfactory. Reunification with Taiwan remains unfinished. She has the world's greatest armada 12 nautical miles off her coast in her face, literally. Her relations with her larger neighbors have all deteriorated in the recent past. Economic integration with her periphery, she feels, should be improved. In fact, that's one of the reasons why BRI is being done. And the problem is that the Western liberal alternative does still exert domestic, political, social, and economic pressure on her. No matter how much one might say in speeches that democracy has failed as a model, etc., etc., fact is there is pressure in practice, which is, so China is still a revisionist power. It's not as though the world that all her needs have been met. She still seeks to adapt and change the present US-led order in her favor, preferably peacefully, without endangering her economic straits in the present structure. But she's building up the power to change it. Now, but I think we shouldn't exaggerate the effect of the opportunity that we see around China today. While China is willing and able to fill the economic vacuum, the military situation around her is much more complex. You might like to look at an article by Michael Beckley in International Survival about the evolving military balance in East Asia. It's worth looking at. Because he makes the argument that the net power calculus in China's immediate periphery might have improved in relative terms, but she is still not militarily preponderant. To take 2 examples, she is in no position to declare a Monroe Doctrine for the South China Sea or the East China Sea. She lacks the military wherewithal, which would be 80 to 90% of the naval assets in the area, and control of the coastline, which is what the US had and Japan had very briefly when she did manage to impose the equivalent. Nor, according to Beckley at least, does she have the capability to actually physically liberate Taiwan unless the government just collapses and vanishes. And perhaps the new Chinese tactic of unrelenting pressure on Taiwan, unlike what they did with Ma Ying-jeou and the KMT government, of trying to co-opt them, this present tactic of pressure, maybe that's what it's designed to create. But in any case, the basic argument is that anti-access, area denial technologies are much cheaper than actual power projection technologies by a huge order of magnitude. And that while China might have made huge progress on A2AD capabilities, and she can prevent another Taiwan Straits crisis like 1996, embarrass the US, but that the military balance is not so unequivocally changed to the point where there's Chinese predominance even in her immediate periphery. Now that's a big difference from political opportunity that we were speaking of. military, and she faces the same problem seeking global predominance or primacy. I'm not even talking about leadership here. Because if you look at the world today, it might be economically multipolar. It's true, the sources of economic growth in the global economy are outside the traditional sources, not the old advanced economies. The share of everyone else has grown. But the world militarily is still primarily unipolar with local variations. And you have this huge imbalance, therefore, between the economic balance of power, the military balance of power, and the political confusion that we see around us. So how does this work? Military power, of course, is in the short run, it's the cutting edge of change. And the military balance is also a measure of immediate opportunity. But as I was trying to say, that's not a very simple calculation or calculus even today from the Chinese point of view. But if we look at the larger drivers of foreign policy that I mentioned, demography, China is aging and will soon be overtaken by India as the most populous country. By 2040, China will have the age profile that Japan has today. And Japan is the grayest of all most of the advanced economies. By 2050, in fact, Japan's median age will be around 53 years. China's will be nearly 50. And West Europe's will be around 47. So median age will actually be even more than West Europe's. This is what the UN estimates. And this has much more than just economic consequences about market demand and needing to spend on pensions and have much less labor in the economy. It also affects military preparedness, the world's largest army's capability to recruit, to find people. It probably explains actually the PLA stress on artificial intelligence and weapon systems. And if history is any guide, certainly older societies do not display the same intent and willingness to project power. They also see a slowdown normally in economic growth and in innovation. And China's demographics therefore suggest that China might actually be facing a relatively short window of opportunity and of the degree of predominance and preponderance that she might enjoy. And this might be one reason why we see such haste in pushing the Belt and Road Initiative, and without spending the time to sit and consult with the neighbors, involve them in the design of the project, could be the sense that this is not a window that's a moment of strategic opportunity that will last for very long. Second long-term driver, of course, is the economy, where clearly economic power shifted. We've all seen how it shifted. I don't need to go into how much of world GDP is where, but is produced where. But the fact is that the conditions that produced China's economic miracle have already changed and are unlikely to return when you look at the world economy. And the effects of the 2008 crisis are not behind us. We're still dealing with many of these. More important than that, there's a fundamental restructuring of the global economy underway, with changes in the energy economy, the application of artificial intelligence, digital manufacturing, changes in genetic engineering and biotechnology, just to name some of the changes which are changing the basic relative costs of factors of production. And this is happening at a time when China is trying to restructure its own economy, when the exports have been a net drag or neutral to China's GDP growth in the last 5 years. So when she's trying to move to a renewed pattern, but unlike Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping is not writing on a blank slate, on a tabula rasa. He's working with a situation where already state-owned enterprises account for only about 20% of urban employment in China today. They account for around a little more than 30% of GDP. So anybody who expects reform to bring this further down, I think is really asking to do much, because you can't cut this further without affecting the rule of the Communist Party and single party rules. So there isn't that much flexibility in this, in the macroeconomy. And the result of that is also that both the economy and society's response to government control and management is much more sluggish. Government's capacity to drive the economy and society and to manage change, to turn it, is less today than it was before. So you have contradictory economic pull. China says she wants to move to a domestically driven economy based on domestic demand and consumption and so on. But there's no way that she can do without the world. In fact, China is more dependent on the rest of the world today than she ever has been in history. Whether it's for energy, whether it's for technology, you name it, for markets, for raw materials, she has never been so connected. So the economy actually drives her to a much more activist stance abroad, to a foreign policy which actually she must, for the sake of her economy at least, shape that external environment to a degree that she hasn't had to before. Same logic applies to technology, where not just for present demand but for the future. But China realizes this and is doing a huge amount of work on this. And I think her dependence on the rest of the world for technology is actually changing much faster than people are willing to give China credit for, and that she will probably return to her historical role as a net provider of knowledge much sooner than certainly the West expects. And there is this prevailing myth that capitalism would bring democracy to China. That, of course, everybody gave up at the end of the 90s. But then the later version was innovation is impossible in a politically repressive society and so on. You look at China's history. Obviously, Sung China, which is horrible politics, divided country, most innovative country in the world. Han China. Frankly, there is no correlation with some of the most oppressive regimes by Chinese historical standards, Sui and so on, but also where there was the most innovation. So, frankly, there is no correlation, and I think anybody who makes those arguments, therefore it will take a long time for China to start innovating and so on, is actually ignoring history, being ahistorical. So if these three, demography, the economy and technology, push China into a much more involved stance in the world, much more engagement, and makes her seek to shape the environment quickly, doesn't give her a very long period to do so. Her problem then is that runs up against geography. Because China, unlike the US, which has the luxury of not just having been predominant in terms of power in her continent for a very long time, but also sits behind two of the world's largest oceans and can retreat into isolationism. China, as we were reminded today, has, by the Vice Chancellor, has boundaries with every part of Asia. But that also means that she's in a crowded, hedged-in environment with other powers over which her relative preponderance of power is not necessarily very great. Whether it's Japan, whether it's India, and this is why throughout history, preoccupations with her immediate neighborhood, barbarian handling, has been such a preoccupation for China, and I don't see that diminishing. I don't see her seeking a global role as providing a solution to this immediate problem that she has consistently faced over history. Because her geography, of course, this confining geography that she has, even the seas near China are enclosed seas. South China Sea, by the island chains, East China Sea, unlike the Indian Ocean, which is an open geography. And therefore, her security problem is quite different from others. But one more point. But last point, the primary purpose of the Chinese regime, like all other regimes, is to stay in power. And the Chinese have chosen, of course, as they always have, that stability above all else, that you need to. And as the state's capacity to deliver growth or to maintain growth or to shape society has decreased, the state has become promising more and more. The 19th Party Congress is a good example. And those promises have grown bigger and bigger. At the same time, controls on free thinking, the media, on civil society have grown much more oppressive than before. And you have, well, new authoritarianism. And the father of that theory is now in the Politburo Standing Committee. So, how does it affect her foreign policy? In the first place, if you base your legitimacy on ultranationalism, your capacity to negotiate, to give and take, to bargain is diminished over what you had before. Secondly, foreign policy then becomes a tool for domestic policy. You start playing foreign policy issues for how it plays at home, rather than dealing with the issues themselves. Your success rate abroad, therefore, is likely to go down. At home, it might increase. And lastly, the more the internal pressure, the harder the external life. So from what I can see, all the fundamental drivers will lead China to a much more engaged, much more activist role abroad. She will try and be. The risk is that the dichotomy between her needs and her practical ability to create outcomes could result in a very frustrated China in the long run, which is really not that long. It's over after the next 5 years or so. But always remember that, as Harold Macmillan used to say, that the one thing that can change all these plans is events, dear boy, events. So let's see what really happens. Thank you.
I thought you were not going to give a lecture now. But you just did that. Very good. I think that was an excellent presentation. I think the question to say many aspects of the body. But we use that today. Our next speaker is Ambassador Bidani.
Thank you. Let me begin with a word of caution. There is a very strong tendency to think of geopolitical developments in Southeast Asia and East Asia generally in what I would call binary terms. If it is not American-centric, it must be a China-centric.
Can't hear you, sir. Not audible, sir.
Oh, sorry. All right. There is a very strong tendency to think of geopolitical developments in East Asia and Southeast Asia in what I would call binary terms. You know, if it is not an American century, it must be a Chinese century. Can you hear me now? It's this tendency to think in binary terms is accentuated by the proclivity of the Western media, and not just the Western media, to look at international developments in East Asia and Southeast Asia almost in sporting terms. Every development must be a win for one side or another side. Now we know international relations is far more complicated than that. And certainly this is not the way the countries of Southeast Asia look at their relationships with the major powers. Now the essential purpose of ASEAN's external diplomacy, external engagements, is to create conditions where each member can enjoy the best possible relationship with all the major powers. Now I'm not saying we always do this very successfully, but this is in principle what we are up to. And it would be very wrong to try to force developments in Southeast Asia or East Asia into a very rigid binary framework. And in fact, it's not the right way to think of US-China relations either. US-China relations have a very strong competitive element, which is natural among major powers. They are infused with strategic mistrust, which is again, I think, not unnatural. But they are also deeply interdependent. And you can see this intertwining of competition and cooperation, in fact, in even a sensitive issue like the South China Sea. I do not think the situation in the South China Sea is pretty much, to my mind, in terms of US-China relations, a stalemate. The Americans cannot make the Chinese dig up those artificial islands that they have created and throw the sand back to the sea, nor can they stop China from occasionally deploying military assets on them. But by the same token, neither can the Chinese stop the Americans from operating in the South China Sea, through the South China Sea, under the South China Sea, over the South China Sea. And this is where they have a common interest, because both of them will not give up what they consider their vital interests, but neither will they want trouble with each other. There is, in fact, what I call the ritualization of competition in the South China Sea, which melds both competition and cooperation. Now, to think in terms of, in binary terms, is not just simplistic and misleading. It can also be, in some ways, dangerous. Because geopolitical competition is not just a matter of material movement of ships or planes or investments or trade. It is also deeply psychological. And to think in binary terms, that if it's not a Chinese, American century, must be a Chinese century, is in fact to reinforce a major theme of Chinese influence operations, which are psychological operations. And to create false choices where you need not necessarily have to choose. The American media in particular is so consumed with its distaste or hatred for Trump that it's doing a far better job than the propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party in propagating this line. Not everything that Mr. Trump has done in East Asia is wrong or bad, and I'll return to this later. That said, it has to be considered that China's rise is a geopolitical fact. And China does enjoy major influence in Southeast Asia by virtue of contiguity, by virtue of its growing economic importance, and nobody will deny this. There is not a single Southeast Asian country that would deny China's rise as a geopolitical fact. There is not a single Southeast Asian country that would want to forego the economic opportunities that rise creates. But that is entirely a different matter from accepting, as I think Ambassador Saran has said and Shishankar has said, accepting China's rise as a new norm of international relations in East Asia. And there has in fact been significant, although not sufficiently noticed, pushback against China in Southeast Asia. I have never forgotten what a Vietnamese colleague once told me when I asked him, what is the significance of, there was a party congress, a change of leadership in Vietnam, this is some years ago, not the recent one. What does it mean for Vietnam's relations with China? I asked him. And I've never forgotten his reply. His reply was, every Vietnamese leader must be able to get along with China and stand up to China, and must do so simultaneously, and if you don't think it can be done simultaneously, you don't deserve to be leader. To some degree, this is how all Southeast Asian countries, some better than others, deal with China and deal with all major powers. The US, India for that matter, Japan, get along with and also draw certain lines, certain boundaries which are out of bounds. I can give you examples. I mean, you can see in Indonesia, you can see in Malaysia, where there's a considerable debate among both Chinese Malaysians and Malay Malaysians about whether China has too much power. You see it in Myanmar. You even see it in Laos, which is a fellow communist country. 2 years ago, the Laos had a party congress of their own, and they removed several senior members of the Politburo and the government that were deemed to be pro-Chinese. They don't have a very large room to maneuver, but what room they have, they take. Another factor that I think the Chinese probably underestimate is the new attitude towards overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia that has become evident under Xi Jinping. Let me see. 3 years ago, Xi Jinping gave a speech to a group of overseas Chinese entrepreneurs in Beijing, and the speech is reproduced in his book, The Governance of China. And the title is very instructive. The title was, and I'm quoting from memory, so but I don't think I'm being totally inaccurate. The rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is of great importance to all Chinese. Now what does that mean? It can be interpreted to mean that the overseas Chinese communities are expected to define their interests, at least on important issues, in terms of China's interests, and align their interests. And that causes great unease in countries like Indonesia, in Malaysia, and even in Singapore. The Chinese, I think, fundamentally do not understand many things about Southeast Asia and even about Singapore, and we have quite a close relationship. They keep calling us a Chinese country. We keep telling them we are not a Chinese country. It just happens that the majority of our population is of Chinese descent, but we organize ourselves not on the basis of being a Chinese country, but on the basis of being a multiracial, meritocratic country. That seems that point seems to be very difficult for Chinese colleagues to grasp. Now, a lot has been said about the global ambition that was evident in Mr. Xi Jinping's speech at the 19th Party Congress. And the ambition was there, and I don't find anything unusual about it because big countries have big ambitions. In fact, the converse would be unusual if a big country did not have big ambitions. But that most of the speech was not an externally oriented speech. It was very profoundly internally oriented. First of all, Mr. Xi Jinping defined a new principal contradiction, to use the Marxist term, between China's unbalanced development and what he called the people's ever-growing desire for a better life. And from that arises a whole slew of very complicated internal issues, from the environment, the provision of social services, to the provision of better housing, and so on. These are all complicated issues, they are internal issues. Secondly, the other major theme of the speech was the need to revitalize the Communist Party as a means of dealing with these extremely complicated problems. And this is again a very internal problem. In a way, some of the external ambition are as important as means of dealing with these internal problems as they are as external ends in themselves. You take the Belt and Road Initiative. One unresolved issue from the 18th Party Congress under Mr. Hu Jintao was what is the proper balance between the market and the state. I think it was recognized very clearly that the old Chinese model was not sustainable over the long run. It needed a new balance for China to keep on growing, for China to improve its economic productivity and so on. Very little has been done, and the same problem exists after the 19th Party Congress, and perhaps even in a more acute sense because Mr. Xi Jinping insisted more strongly on the communist character of the Chinese state, and insisted while he talked about the need for the market, he also talked about the need for state capital. In a way, the Belt and Road is the export of this model, heavy reliance on infrastructure, heavy reliance on state-owned industry, and so on, export of surplus capacity, because they know it is not sustainable internally, export it to buy a little more time to try and figure out what is the correct balance internally. And in strategic terms, I agree with Ambassador Menon. China is in a very unfavorable position. You have Japan. Japan will never accept Chinese superiority as a new norm of East Asian international relations. You have North Korea, China's only former ally, but one that China has very little influence or ability to influence. And therefore, that will set a limit to what China can do with South Korea. You go down to the ASEAN countries, I told you there have been significant pushback. And throughout Southeast Asian history, Southeast Asia, because of its very diversity, has been impossible to capture in its entirety by any major power. The Americans tried, they failed. The Soviet Union tried, it failed. Couldn't even capture Indonesia. Indonesia has a long history of taking the money and doing what it wants. Anyway, I don't think it will change. And if you go further down, India is another civilization. It's not going to accept Chinese superiority as a new norm of the international relations of this area. So if you look throughout the whole swathe, from Japan down to the Persian Gulf, there are only two countries that China can be said to be very clearly on its side, Cambodia and Pakistan. Now that is not exactly the definition of a very favorable geopolitical situation. And I think the Chinese know it. And in a way, the Belt and Road moving westwards is a way to try to break out of it, but you will have the same problems there. Now, I'm not arguing that China is going to fail. I don't think that is a valid assumption, because China is a very adaptable creature. The Communist Party of China, unlike the Communist Party of the former Soviet Union, is a very adaptable and creative organization. But what it means is, I think, it will succeed at best in patches, not in entirety. I don't think it can create an alternative system. In January this year, and again in November, in January at Davos in Switzerland, and in November at the APEC summit in Da Nang in Vietnam, Mr. Xi Jinping stood up and delivered very eloquent and heartfelt, I think, defenses of globalization. Yes, and this was taken generally as a sign of great confidence, and I think it was a sign of confidence. But equally, it can be taken as an implicit concern about what it would mean for China to globalization falter. Because the Belt and Road Initiative, China's own growth, rests on the foundation of the current order. It is not an alternative to the current order. Can the Belt and Road succeed if the world turns protectionist? Can it succeed if there is a US-China trade war? I don't think so. And I think the Chinese leadership knows it too. I don't see China as providing a new model. Why? Because it is such a Chinese model, it is going to be very difficult to replicate it outside China in exactly the same way. It is also a model built on the framework of a communist state or a Leninist state. And there are only 5 left. I'm not against saying that China will fail, but that will be a limit to what it can do. It will succeed in patches. So it is not an alternative. Let me end with a few words on American policy in Southeast Asia, because you really cannot talk about Chinese policy without talking about American policy. I said earlier that it is simply untrue that everything Mr. Trump has done in East Asia is bad or wrong. Yes, his cancellation of the TPP was a great blow to American credibility. That is undeniable. And it's quite clear that Mr. Trump does not like multilateral trade deals. But he is not against trade per se. He is not a common or garden variety protectionist. He wants fair trade, not free trade. And that is a very old strain in American political culture. In other words, he is not in retreat, even on the trade front. He is asserting American national interests more narrowly, more transactionally, but not pulling back. Apart from trade, and insofar as it creates new risks, these risks pertain as much to China as to any other country in East Asia. And in the non-trade field, in the political security field, I think I see a reversion to the historical norm or a correction of mistakes made by the second Obama administration. I said the cancellation of the TPP was a great blow to American credibility. And it was. But Obama's drawing a red line over Syria and then failing to enforce it was as great a blow. And Mr. Trump has restored the credibility of the American willingness to use force. He has reaffirmed the alliance system. He has, at least this year, attended all the major multilateral diplomatic forums. He cut short his visit to the EAS a bit, but that is as much as the fault of the host who started the whole meeting 2 hours late. I would be as irritated as he was, I think. And he has given far more freedom to the 7th Fleet to conduct freedom of navigation operations. I do not see America doing us a favor, because America is a Pacific power, and in its own interest, it will be there in a different way, in a more assertive way, maybe in a more transactional way. But I do not see any retreat, at least for now. One final point, and I'll finish, and that's really to repeat a point with which I started. That the great power gain in East Asia and Southeast Asia is as much psychological as it is material. And we should not forget that, and we should not work ourselves into a fatalistic frame of mind one way or the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Always very comprehensive and very focused. I think couple of common threads in the two presentations we got so far. Both of you have highlighted the importance of the domestic situation and domestic requirements and their impact on foreign policy. I think both of you also highlighted that China does not quite have that open field to dominate Asia or the rest of the world as perhaps would appear. And I think the important point you made, Mr. Koshikan, is that the United States is not in retreat, and that you reminded us that China has been a major beneficiary of the international status. Having said that, I'd like to now request Professor Dwara to make his presentation.
Thank you. I feel like a bit of an interloper, first among two very distinguished and eloquent foreign secretaries and more, but also an interloper that I'm a historian among an ex-historian and an international relations expert. So, but I'll do my best and see. Incidentally, Mr. Koshikan, I think that the America may not be in retreat, but Trump may be in retreat right now. There's a lot of chaos going on internally. So is there some way, I don't think I can, I had, as an academic, I had prepared a long, which seems to have a hard time coming on, so I can't really talk without it. Okay, that we see. Can we just go to the next one? I guess so, yeah. So I'm going to cut short this, but I'll have it up so that you don't look at me and look at that. But I had begun by, I had also presented at the conference that was organized in March by ICS. And I, being a historian, I don't have too many, and not being a diplomatic historian, I don't have too many papers on these, on the modern world order, but I did put together something. And what I want to give you today is much more a historical account of what both of you have talked about, which I found very compelling and actually is continuous with the historical situation I want to present. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole sequence of modern world orders, but you did have the Westphalian, which, just to summarize my view of it, is that it's a question of theoretical equality among recognized states, but practically everybody is very highly intrusive in each other's affairs, territorially competitive and dominating. And of course, the rest of the world is subject to the plunder of this organized territorial nation states. I see Panchashila of 1954-55 very much as an extension of the Westphalian idea, but for a post-colonial order. And there's a very big difference there because, of course, the rest of the world now is also organized as nation states. I mean, you may have a club, but then you have certain rights as nation states, which makes it different. And between Westphalia and Panchashila, there was what I have called the imperialism of nation states, the Cold War order, which has military domination, certainly, financial and cultural domination. But sovereignty, as we know from the case of Indonesia and many others, is not meaningless. It plays a role, and nation states could have the capacity to develop within that. So really the question is, how do we see the post-Cold War order? I mean, especially in the 21st century after the US pullback, and I do think there's been a certain pullback, we can move on. And so this is the problem that I want to locate our understanding of the historical Chinese world order, which Shankar Menon did refer to in the Song period and so on. And I think it's, I'm not going to go into the theoretical basis of it, but I see it very much more like a language game, the Wittgensteinian language game, than a system. It is one which is, a system is usually bounded by a single principle or doctrine, say of sovereignty. But this language game is much more open-ended. And one of the ideas that you can one of the ways you can comprehend this open-endedness of the tributary system is that, firstly, the tributary system of Qing China, beyond the borders or beyond what the imperium, was a continuation of really tributary modes with provinces within China. And so there was a very interesting continuity there, and roles changed a lot in that. But then look at the Chinese world order, which also had very different principles, like with the Dalai Lama, with the Buddhists, or with the Mongols, and where it is true that the Qing occupied the position of Manjushri, the Bodhisattva, but at the same time, the Bodhisattva that the Buddhists of Western East Asia occupied, or China, or the Qing Empire. The Dalai Lama didn't kowtow to the Chinese emperor. He came halfway, and the Chinese emperor stepped down, and they met as more or less mentor to student or to disciple, where the Dalai Lama is the mentor. But of course, the disciple is also the sovereign in some sense of the word. So these are very complex notions, and these are performative roles through a lot of ritual and other performative procedures, which gives it a certain flexibility. So you have a kind of flexibility where you can also justify people's refusal to acknowledge it by using this the system of ritual provision. So you say, when the Western powers come and they actually take away power in the treaty courts and so on, as Bank told us, they said, oh, we've always let barbarians govern other barbarians themselves, right? So this allowed this kind of flexibility, and even before the Westerners, they would do this kind of thing. But I think one of the most important dimensions of the Qing world order, the tribute system, is trade and economics, if we can go to the next slide. So, and in this flexible order, basically you had also, sometimes the Chinese emperors would have to pay tribute themselves. So in the Song, the Chinese emperors had to pay tribute to the Khitan and the Tangut. But through all of that, they still came out ahead economically. Because what they did was that whatever bowls of silk and silver and so on they paid to the barbarian states, enabled the barbarian states, which sounds very remarkably like now, to then buy a lot of Chinese goods, right? And this was, of course, made possible by the official format, by the official framework of the tribute order. And this kind of thing then becomes widespread, especially after China and Mughal India, but China till much later, becomes the silver sink, the global sink for silver. And the Chinese system begins to operate on silver, and basically you find that the whole tribute system through Southeast Asia, through Myanmar, through Nepal, we could also pay tribute, would be commercial transactions in many of these societies right through the 18th century became dependent on the price structure of silver within China. And so you have, it became loosely integrated through the use of silver as a medium for settling China's surpluses. And the key, of course, was the huge demand for Chinese goods outside China, which is not very different from now, nor was it very different from the Tang period. And the differences of prices within China and outside China. Now, and the interesting thing to note here is that the economics becomes more and more important, especially during the Qing period. So even the East India Company was willing to kowtow and do all kinds of things until 1833, when the British government, the monarchical nation state, replaces the East India Company, and they refused to kowtow, and you have the McCartney mission, and then you have the Opium War. It's all clear from there. So this was a flexibility that enabled the interlacing of cultural and economic goals of various players, which without significant use of military violence. Now, let's go to the next one. So let's look a little bit at military power. That is, of course, not to say that the Chinese imperial system did not deploy military violence beyond the borders of the empire. We all know, and An Sen here is sitting here, and he is an advocate of the nation, that the Ming naval expeditions led by Admiral Chang Ho was in fact imperialistic, and it forced tribute, it captured slaves, even a king in Sri Lanka, or a competitor king in Sri Lanka, which brought Nanjing, and then released him in the end. But it was demonstration. People have been talking today about demonstration of the power. And there was violence for sure. But I think that certainly over the sea route, this military authority was not maintained and could not be maintained. That's the capabilities issue, right? Beyond a brief window in the 15th century. Nor was the land route something that they could control. You know, the nomads were always much more important in controlling the land routes from West Asia. So, in an interesting way, the military dimensions of it signifies actually the weakness, the sorrow of empire. Because what would happen, the main threat to the tribute model was that you always had groups of people, these lesser people, these same Cold War subordinates, right, who would harass the whole system at the frontier. And no one was a bigger harasser for the Qing than the Burmese, right? They would sack the Yunnan and so on, and they would have to pursue them. And so, but the Qing did not want to use military violence because it often didn't work out for them anyway. And you couldn't keep that kind of control on the borders. And so you ultimately had to reach some kind of equilibrium. You buy off, and they use military violence principally as a punitive measure. You know, if somebody is getting away with too much, affecting the order, they would send this in. So I'm of course not saying that this is all the same situation now, but I'm giving you, if you're looking at historical forms, you see that it was one that, in a sense, against the ideas of many people, I think there is a kind of possibility that something like this might reemerge again, right? There's a kind of a containment of its own power, by its own power, and by the expenses of its own power, something which, of course, the US ultimately has to face as well. And but particularly, so we can try and see, can OBOR reproduce such a win-win condition? And I think ultimately not, but in the same way that the tribute system could not, in a sense. So now,
OBOR also does very similar things. It combines.
Is it still on? Yeah. It combines culture and economics of investment and trade with an apparently cooperative and a light military presence. As such, it could be comparable to the imperial tribute system. So, couldn't we sort of try and think of it as a new traditional soft power? This is the kind of point I was trying to make in my March presentation. Can we move on? Next slide. So, of course, it is true that the new conditions of capitalism, which is built upon the treadmill of continuously accelerated production, nationalism, statism, changes everything, changes the game, no question about it. Chinese capitalism abroad has tended to be extractive and energy hungry. There are investments in mammoth logistical infrastructure ventures, and the migration of small Chinese businessmen has also produced a lot of social tensions. So there are all these issues that have been, that we can see also coming with the OBOR, quite apart from the fact that OBOR has a lot of problems because interministerial disagreements and competition, which is classically, what happens in highly developed societies, who have little fiefdoms that develop within ministerial structures. But it's very interesting to see the extent to which the Chinese can force their will in some societies and not in others, and how they respond in other societies, right? So Central Asian societies have weak civil societies, so resistance to these projects is not immediately visible. And of course, Chinese investors will have to tread very carefully across minefields, local conflicts, civil wars. Can we go on? Yeah. So, and we know that I think that it is in the Southeast Asian countries that China's neighborhood strategy has been felt very sharply. We know that China had very good relations in the 1990s with the Southeast Asian countries. And then now also it has, of course, lost a lot of its goodwill and trust and so on. But as Mr. Bilahari said, Ambassador Bilahari said, there is a fair amount of pushback and understanding of this as well. And there are, of course, huge problems in China's relations in Southeast Asia, less to do with maritime and trade and so on, and more to do with the dams and the effects of these dams, which incidentally has also produced an enormous civil society response in the Mekong Delta and in Burma and in many other places, which is a very interesting pushback. And one of the things we're seeing, and this is where there is civil society activism, is that actually Chinese corporate capital, hydropower, which is bigger than most multinational firms all over the world, are actually beginning to respond. They respond, they listen to these, I don't know how much action they take, but they do respond to these civil societies. They sit on the table, provide some input, output. There is corporate social responsibility. Whether or not they pull back is, how much they pull back is a matter of politics, much more, right? Okay. So what are the options for the future? To what extent can the cultural, economic, and political flexibility of the imperial Chinese tribute model prevail over militaristic, nationalistic, and expansionist ambitions? Now, we've all talked about how China is not playing in the same world as even 50 years ago when the US had a clean slate, and it was able to combine its cultural soft power with military and economic infra power. With constraints on its military power, can China deploy soft power to influence outcomes? Just with financial and economic leverage and a sense of fair exchange? Will it export its high-tech connective sector in BRI or its energy-intensive overcapacity sectors? I mean, the temptation is very much to export this overcapacity stuff, but these are all the things that we will need to look at to judge how it's. Now, to look at the possibilities, I offered two scenarios. On the one hand, it has a version of walking on two legs, soft power of culture and economic diplomacy, as well as some military power, for instance, in the South China Sea. So you continue the two legs policy, or do you, in fact, put more emphasis on soft power and economic diplomacy? Yet we know even if the soft power option is taken, it is premised on some hard power in order to get other countries to want your outcomes. This is Joseph Nye's formulation, which I have revised to say that it is based on a hard power. In the age of many deterrents to open warfare, the military components will probably be found not in outright open conflict, but proxy wars, outsourced either to allies, mercenaries, rebels, terrorists, and so on, which is what the US has been doing for a while as well. Now, what I think it should do, and the way we can judge whether or not it is developing a fruitful approach to its new global new global outreach. I think it needs to take the leadership in global climate change activism, not only by top-down technological approaches, but also by creating a framework for community participation. Partly you're beginning to see that when they are pressured by civil society groups. Chinese soft power will have to incorporate more democratic participation in ventures abroad. there is some evidence in the Mekong, and East Africa negotiations with civil society very different. So I'll just leave it. Thank you.
Stick to the 15 minutes.
You took your 20 minutes. Thank you very much, Prasenjit. That was a fascinating presentation. I think you basically put forward the proposition that is China flexible enough to make sure that it uses the right approaches as you go ahead. I think that's what this whole debate is about. Can China react in a sensitive manner to pushback or to the kind of feedback it is getting, or will it simply go a sort of hammer and tongs at achieving its objectives? But I think the neo-traditional soft power approach that you talked about, I think it's something which, again, I'm sure there will be questions on. I certainly have many questions about that, but I think that historical perspective is extremely valuable. So, distinguished delegates, friends, we have half an hour for question and answer. If you have clarifications, I'm sure our speakers will be happy to give those also. But please try and be brief so that we can because we need to have as many questions as possible. I know. So, Tansen, you want to start? Okay.
Let me start. Is there a mic or it's a major concern I have. Where's that? I think you are supposed to read my book. This is somewhat a major concern I have. Listening to the panels today and looking at the program, it seems our understanding of China is becoming too statist. We are just looking at China as if the leadership and the state matters, the people don't. There have been references to civil society and common people. Chinese people have gone through huge changes. Do they not matter? Are we not supposed to study them? The mention was made on the overseas Chinese. How the overseas Chinese have been looking at the Chinese state after the reform period started. How the common people looks at the state and needs a strong state, as surveys in China, not the state surveys, but surveys by sociologists have pointed out. Are we just looking at China from the state perspective? Are we forgetting the society, the common people? Do they not matter in all these things? When are we going to talk about it? Is Chinese studies in India all going to be state focused?
That's a question you could have put to the organizer. But I think in the limited context of this session, I think I would tend to weigh on the side of the speakers who chose to focus on the strategic aspect. But I'm sure each one of them has a view on this. But I think the point which was made by Ambassador Kaushikan has to be borne in mind. We are talking about a system or a situation in China where the focus is, at least for the Communist Party China, is to see how it can keep itself in power. Now the question is, are the people willing to accept that or not accept that? And so far there are no visible signs of the people vehemently sort of not wanting to keep the Communist Party.
But isn't that
But having said that, I think maybe each one of our panelists would need to respond to that. So Prasenjit, you start with you?
With me?
Yeah. You're the historian.
Yeah. Well, I think Nalin is right. I mean, the topic is about the leadership of the nation state. But, in order to unpack that, and I have tried to do this in a recent piece in the Harvard Journal Studies, is try to see what is the relationship between nationalism and popular nationalism and the whole sort of Communist Party legitimacy, right? And how the internal and external relate, which is also not talking about people in the way that I think you want us to do, but that would be a different topic, and certainly we can talk about it. But I think that this intermediate part of how nationalism is used, right, or how nationalism develops, it's both a top-down and a bottom-up thing. Once it's successful, is something that we could also discuss within this forum.
No, I think you're right, Tansen. People matter, and from what I've seen, this GW, they've done the survey and you must have seen in 2008, 2012, most of their surveys seem to suggest that strong leadership, statist policies are popular and increasingly so in China, and that actually the leadership, this is what the leadership feeds into. The problem is that foreign policy is made by states, and between states, and certainly when you look east of India, that's true. Maybe west of India, it's less true in Western Asia, where non-state actors are more powerful than the states. But certainly, the further east you look, the stronger the states. And they are very strong, and they seem to, the popular opinion seems to be on their side actually, in using nationalism and using these. So, we have no other category when you're told to speak on strategic underpinnings of foreign policy. What else do you look at? Except those who actually make it. That's the problem. Now, you might say this is not an ideal situation and this doesn't reflect the whole reality, but people are not making foreign policy, or they're not even suggesting a different foreign policy in these states today. That's the problem.
I really don't know how to answer your question, but let me try anyway. Maybe it doesn't quite answer your question, but you give me an opportunity to raise a point that's always puzzled me. The Chinese Communist Party is, as I said, a very creative, very flexible, and very adaptable organization, and very powerful, of course, and becoming more powerful under Mr. Xi Jinping. But at the same time, it has always been plagued by a persistent insecurity. I came across, almost by accident, a book by a Chinese sociologist by the name of Fei Xiaotong. And it gave me a clue, and it kind of answers your question. Because he locates the deep structure of Chinese society in networks centered on individuals, not in institutions. And I can't think of a structure that is more opposed to the structure of a Leninist state than a structure centered on networks of individuals. And that might account for the deep insecurity as well as the strong power. A related point is this. You cannot disregard public opinion in China. It is a public opinion that the Communist Party both cultivates, highly nationalistic, almost sometimes xenophobic, but also fierce. And I think Shri Shankar made the point that this limits, in some ways, flexibility for maneuver, which might answer your question, Professor, right? The question you posed. I've always wondered about this because I see this as a great danger. I said, for example, in the South China Sea, the common interest, the cooperative aspect of between US and China is neither one's trouble. Neither is going to give up its interest, neither one's trouble. But supposing an incident happens, and public opinion may drive policy in China down a path it doesn't really want to tread. Because ultimately, again, it is all about the preservation of Communist Party rule. And I think there is no real alternative to Communist Party rule in China. I've always told my American friends, you want multi-party system in China, you will regret it. Because with this kind of public opinion, a multi-party system will make Mr. Trump look like a real moderate. But the two factors are related in the sense, how do you constantly, if I was sitting in Beijing, how do you constantly maintain a balance between the public opinion that you have to use to bolster your legitimacy, but not let it limit your flexibility as you go out into the world, where there will be many unexpected developments which the Chinese people may not completely understand because they have been fed a certain narrative, which is a rather selective narrative. It's a good question, but I have no answer.
I'm Avinash Kodbole. I'm from the ICWA. My question is for Professor Ambassador Kausikan about the recently agreed upon the COC. Are you happy about the way it's turned out to be, and do you think it will be effective, and what's the way forwards from here?
Good evening. I'm Ravi Bhuthalingam, Institute of Chinese Studies. First of all, thank you all for your excellent presentations. I enjoyed listening to you. My question is based on Prasenjit's presentation, but I'd like to hear the opinions of the others also. I was very struck with your image of the BRI as a kind of avatar, as it were, in a modified form of the tributary system. And the picture you drew, that China wants to move into the high technology, high value added economy for itself, the domestic sector. And BRI is one vehicle for it to deal with the other stuff which goes out. At the same time, you pointed out the dangers of that. Now, my question is this.
Which were also the historical.
That's right. So, from your knowledge of Chinese intellectual development, property development, inventions in the past that China had, many of very rapid rate, as Needham has pointed out. China today says it does not have the same approach to intellectual property as does the West. So going forward, coming to the point of my question is, do you see China with the BRI going forward and this issue, treating intellectual property differently in some way, how I can't say, but differently than it is today? This will be very vital because the progressive economies of the future is going to be largely based on intellectual property, not brute labor. So how is China going to deal with that? And does the historical background give us any clues as to how and what it might do? And the other's perspective.
I'm Shibarna Patel from Don Bosco University, Assam. My question is for Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon. So in the context of the 19th Party Congress, you said how promises have grown and authoritarianism also has grown, which is affecting the foreign policy. During the Doklam standoff, it was said that we have to wait till the end of the 19th Party Congress and maybe it will fizzle out after that because it's all being done for the 19th Party Congress. At the same time, you also said that economy is driving China's foreign policy to a degree which we haven't seen before. So, would their need for economic cooperation with us ensure a more, maybe more stress on India joining the BRI or some kind of an amicable cooperation framework with us? Or would we see more Doklams in the future because of this increased aggression?
However, now, what has been agreed is not the code of conduct. It's a code of conduct for the South China Sea. What has been agreed between ASEAN countries and China is not the code of conduct per se, it is a framework for a code of conduct. And there's a lot of negotiation yet to be done. What the final shape will be, I cannot say, nobody can really say right now. Now, it's quite clear, however, it's not going to be legally binding. This is not because China doesn't want it to be legally binding. I mean, I must admit some of my ASEAN colleagues who are claimant states are not particularly enthusiastic about it being legally binding either. For a very simple reason, because if you believe that this is my sovereign territory, why should I tie my hands? Why should I tie my hands by some multilateral instrument about what I can do with what I believe is my own property, right? So I think it's a bit early to say what is going to come out of this process. Don't forget, the Declaration of Conduct for the South China Sea took some 10 years to negotiate, and the implementations for guidelines for the Declaration of Conduct took another 10 years to negotiate, and a code of conduct is certainly going to be at least as complicated, if not more complicated than the Declaration of Conduct. Okay, maybe 30, okay, let's see. One small point about intellectual property. Singapore is nowadays very religious about protecting intellectual property. It was not always so, because when we had no intellectual property to protect, we were far from religious about protecting it. And I think something like that might happen to China too.
Yes. Basically, that's my response to it. I mean, to give you a somewhat more academic answer, before you
had competitive national capitalism, in fact, there was no question of intellectual property, right? All these things, that's what made the world move around. before, right? And it's every country you see that has become an innovator then begins to want to, in the modern nation state system, then becomes a defender of intellectual property rights. These are all captured, yes, the US itself, which produced the idea of intellectual property rights once it arrived there, right? So these are all catch-up strategies. You know, you take, I'm even thinking of accountability. Because, you know, once the catch-up takes place, then you restrict others and you see what is. So this is going to happen. So it is very interesting to see when other countries take apart these new Chinese innovations and how China will then get, because it will be forced to defend a universal principle, right? If it wants to protect its own, it can't really push it just on its own innovation. It'll have to defend it across the board. I may be wrong, but I think it will suddenly change the end.
On Doklam and whether economic cooperation or Belt and Road will, you know, my own feeling is these are all symptoms of stress in the relationship. Because I think and I've said this before, the relationship worked well for about 30 years on the basis of a strategic understanding which was reached in the 80s, formalized during Rajiv Gandhi's visit in 1988, which was all right for its time. But today, both countries have changed, India, China. Our definition of our interests has grown. We rub up against each other much more in the periphery, wherever we are. And we have a whole set of new issues which we are now dealing with. So you need a new strategic framework. And unless you do that, you will run the risk of all kinds of little things going wrong. And just saying we'll cooperate economically won't be enough. We have big stakes in that economic relationship, both of us. And we are a major destination for China's project expo. China's our biggest trading partner in goods. But that's not enough to deal with this unless we have a strategic framework which we both agree on. And I think it can be done, but that's another 3 hours at the end of this session.
Next round of questions, yes, please.
Good evening, sir. I'm Kamal Khan. My question pertains to the issues that were brought out over here in 19th Party Congress and President Xi Jinping. More than the internal domestic issues, I would say more about consolidation of political power. My question to Ambassador Menon is, where do you think, sir, Xi Jinping derives his power from the inner circle to be in that particular position? Especially so when there is so much of turmoil and so much of political turbulence. Just 1 week before the party congress, two of his close confidants in CMC, Fang Hui and Chang Yang, were sacked, they were out. And 1 month before, the Chongqing Party Congress party chief Sun was out. So how do you think President Xi Jinping is able to survive in this kind of environment where there's so much of political turbulence? And we are talking about a vision up to 2050. Who's the next leadership in line which is going to take it forward to 2050? Thank you.
If I knew, I'd be General Secretary of the CCP.
Sir, I'm Group Captain Pranjal. My question is, most of the debate about China in our country, and probably in the Southeast Asia as well, tends to revolve around the rivalry because of the growth paths and trajectory of both our countries. And while we do acknowledge that China has risen for the last 3 decades at a very fast pace, and that is why it's militarily and economically stronger, could we not have a different approach to our thinking in saying that, like China did with respect to United States, while always acknowledging the strength of United States, but always drew its strength from United States itself by using it as a market, and in the terms of defense, they probably from borrowing to stealing, they did everything to gain their military strength. So could we look at that approach instead of just looking the other way around as rivalry?
Sir,
I'm Dr. Rajkumar Sharma from IGNOU. My question is to Ambassador Menon. Sir, China recently indicated that they would do something early harvest on border issue if India is willing to do something, find a convergence between Act East and BRI. And somewhere you also mentioned during your comments that BRI is an opportunity for India. No, I don't think I can ask this question to I can't see any fittest person than you. You have been involved in the negotiations. Do you think there is some scope for to do something on the border if India does something, say, we find something in BRI useful and we indicate it to them? Can we do something? Or it's just a carrot they are dangling to India? So that's and sub part of the question is, you mentioned of a strategic window for China in your lecture. My question was, during this strategic window, do you think what could be China's behavior towards India? Will they get more assertive, or maybe there could be a balance? I mean, that is.
Good evening, sir. I am Captain Vishal from the Naval War College. Sir, I want to ask a very basic question. Everywhere we hear and we read that China is acting as a hegemon now. But sir, if I may play as a devil's advocate, aren't we the same in our neighborhood? If we ask smaller countries like say Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, they feel the same. They say that India is acting as a boss, as a big brother in the area. Isn't it a very natural corollary, sir, that any emerging power would behave in this manner? Sir, your comments on this, please.
I'm Manoranjan Mahanti, Institute of Chinese Studies. The panel has very persuasively argued that the possibilities of China acquiring a leadership role are limited. And there are various reasons. And the historical lessons, the 5 or 6 aspects that Shankar Menon pointed out, and the Southeast Asia experience also lead us to that. In that case, can we notice a very carefully crafted balance of two kinds of statements, not only in the political report to the 19th Party Congress, but in other reports. Namely, one set of comments which the chair read out. Another set of comments relate to shared future or common destiny of the humankind. They say mankind, but primarily should be humankind. Then the win-win situation for mutual development as a basic characteristic of the BRI. This is in the party constitution's new addition. And several other words are the what are read as the assertion of great power ambitions. Are those statements mainly meant for political mobilization of the of the population at a time when Xi Jinping indeed is facing a lot of undercurrents of challenges? I mean, the anti-corruption campaign, the dismissals, the economic crisis, the imbalances, the assertion of the core leader, which shows that there are many who are not abiding by his instructions, therefore the demand for alignment with central policies and so on. In other words, that is meant for the domestic audience, whereas a balanced picture was meant for the global audience, but the global audience has picked up the great power. Thank you.
Well, whether if we were more accommodating on BRI, there was something available on the boundaries, I really don't know. I've been retired now more than 3 years. I'm a happy free man and ignorant. But it seems to me that, the problem here is not doing that kind of tactical deal. I think the problem is, how is it neither of your interests to get into trouble? You don't want it to happen by accident, but is there anything to be gained from confrontations like at Doklam and so on, which actually serves your interest or their interest? Is there any gain there? That I don't see one today. I don't see a situation where that is useful to either side today. In that situation, I don't think, it makes sense. Now, whether there's a deal on the table saying we'll do a deal on the boundary if you do something on behalf, all that I don't know. I really don't know. And I'd be very careful about, assuming from one statement or the other that about the question about aren't we also hegemonic in our neighborhood, I think there is, you notice I never use the word hegemonic because I don't think that's the goal here. Because neither of us, not China, not India, certainly has the kind of predominance of power that allows hegemony in our own immediate neighborhood. I mean, for the Chinese, it's quite clear. You have the world's greatest armada next to you. None of your neighbors is really subject to your power the way, or is so inferior to in power as, say, Mexico and Canada are to the US. Nor is it true in our case. Secondly, if you look at the actual exercise of our power, frankly, we are in a situation where most of our neighbors are quite happy to invite you and get you involved. They will simultaneously use you to get the Chinese involved and use the Chinese to get you involved. And I would do the same in their position. If you're going to respond to stimuli like that, by him telling you the Chinese are building this, why don't you build it? And if you're ready to build it, and he's getting it free, and he gets two of them, I do the same. So I think we must expect this kind of language where people say, oh, you're being hegemonic and therefore I'm going elsewhere. And they'll go elsewhere and tell them that, look, save me from Indian hegemony. All this is normal. This, I think, is part of the rhetoric of politics. I don't think we should take it seriously. But you can look at what we have actually done in our neighborhood and see what the practice of Indian diplomacy in the neighborhood has been. And then I think you'd come to a very different conclusion. I don't think you would think it's hegemonic.
No, I think that was a comment. We have 3 minutes. If there are no further questions, it remains
We to thank our distinguished panelists. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. And maybe perhaps some of you are too hungry to ask more questions. But as chair, I don't have the facility to ask questions. But thank you all three very much. It's been a wonderful experience to chair this session. I think we've come up with some very clear conclusions in terms of what we mean by what we interpret as China's quest for leadership in the region. Time will tell whether we are right or we are wrong. But with those final words, thank you all very much, and thank you, ICS, for asking us to take part.